Carl Jung documented a psychological moment so rare that most people live their entire lives without experiencing it. He called it the click, that singular instant when everything you've been unconsciously struggling with suddenly becomes crystal clear. Jung observed this pattern across hundreds of patients, and what terrified him most was how close people came to this realization without ever crossing the threshold. They would spend years circling the truth, sensing something was wrong, feeling the pressure building, until one day, in a flash that lasted mere seconds, their entire psychological reality reorganized itself. But here's what Jung warned about this moment. You can't prepare for it, you can't force it, and you absolutely cannot ignore it once it happens. Today I'll show you the signs Jung identified that appear right before the click, and why this moment either transforms you completely or destroys the illusion you've been living inside. The feeling starts subtly. You wake up one morning and something feels off, but you can't name it. You go through your routines, same job, same relationships, same habits, but now they feel hollow, like you're watching yourself perform in a play you never auditioned for. Jung called this the pre-integration state, where your unconscious mind has already recognized a truth that your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. You feel restless without reason. Conversations that used to satisfy you now feel empty. Activities that brought joy now feel mechanical. You find yourself staring at walls, lost in thoughts you can't quite grasp, sensing that something fundamental is wrong with how you're living. Jung noticed this pattern appearing in patients months before their psychological breakthrough. They would describe feeling like actors in their own lives, going through motions that no longer held meaning. Consider a case profile that illustrates this dynamic perfectly. An individual reported feeling like wearing a costume that had become too tight, suffocating, but unable to figure out how to take it off. Another composite example, based on Jung's observed patterns, described living behind glass, watching life happen without truly participating. These descriptions weren't depression or anxiety in the clinical sense. They were symptoms of consciousness trying to break through the persona, the social mask Jung identified as the barrier between who you pretend to be and who you actually are. Your unconscious mind communicates through discomfort. It sends signals that something needs to change, but these signals don't arrive as clear thoughts or logical arguments. They arrive as vague feelings of wrongness, as sudden, emotional reactions that seem disproportionate, as dreams that disturb you without revealing their meaning. Jung spent decades studying how the unconscious tries to get the conscious mind's attention, and he discovered that most people ignore these signals for years, sometimes decades, because acknowledging them would require dismantling the life they've built. But the unconscious doesn't give up. It escalates. The vague discomfort becomes sharper. You start noticing patterns you've been blind to. You see how you always choose the same type of person in relationships, how you sabotage yourself at the same point in every project, how you react with the same defensiveness to the same criticism. Jung called this pattern recognition the beginning of shadow awareness, where you start seeing the parts of yourself you've denied and projected onto others. You begin to understand that the things that irritate you most about other people are actually reflections of qualities you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. This is when the resistance intensifies. Your ego, the part of you that maintains your self-image, fights back against these realizations. It provides justifications, rationalizations, excuses. It convinces you that other people are the problem, that circumstances are the problem, that you're simply unlucky or misunderstood. The ego's job is to maintain psychological stability, and nothing threatens stability more than discovering that your entire personality might be a construction designed to win approval rather than express authenticity. Jung observed that the stronger the persona, the more violent the resistance to seeing through it. People in this pre-click state often experience what Jung termed psychic inflation or deflation. Either they inflate their ego to cosmic proportions, convincing themselves they're special, misunderstood geniuses whom the world simply doesn't appreciate, or they deflate completely, deciding they're worthless, broken, fundamentally flawed. Both responses are defense mechanisms preventing the real realization that you're neither special nor broken, but simply unconscious. You've been living according to programs installed by parents, culture, trauma, and unconscious agreements about who you should be. Then something cracks. Usually it's a crisis. A relationship ends. A career collapses. Someone dies. A health scare forces you to confront mortality. Jung noticed that the click rarely happens during comfortable periods. It requires pressure, stress, the breaking down of old structures. When your external world crumbles, the internal structures you've built can no longer hide behind them. You're forced to sit with yourself, to face the psychological content you've spent years avoiding. But even in crisis, the click doesn't happen automatically. Jung documented cases where people experience devastating loss and still manage to rebuild the same unconscious patterns, finding new situations to recreate old dramas. The difference between those who clicked and those who didn't came down to one factor: the willingness to sit in the discomfort without immediately trying to fix it, escape it, or explain it away. The people who experienced the click were those who could tolerate not knowing, who could sit with the anxiety of their world falling apart. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com, without rushing to rebuild it according to the same blueprint. In those moments of stillness, surrounded by the wreckage of what used to work, something shifts. The voice in your head, the constant narrator that's been telling you who you are and what everything means, suddenly seems less authoritative. You notice it's just a voice, not the ultimate truth. You observe your thoughts rather than being completely identified with them. You feel your emotions without believing they define you. Jung called this the beginning of conscious awareness, where you step back from total identification with your psychological content and start to see it as content rather than reality. This is terrifying because it means everything you thought was solid is actually fluid. Your personality isn't fixed. Your beliefs aren't absolute truths. Your identity isn't who you really are, but rather a story you've been telling yourself and others. The solid ground you thought you were standing on dissolves, and you're floating in psychological space without coordinates. Most people panic at this point and grab onto anything that promises stability, even if it means reconstructing the same prison they just escaped. But if you can stay present in that floating state, if you can resist the urge to immediately create a new identity to replace the one that's crumbling, something extraordinary happens. The click. In a moment that Jung described as simultaneously terrifying and liberating, you see through the entire game. You understand that you've been playing a role, that everyone around you is playing roles, that most of human suffering comes from identifying completely with these roles, instead of recognizing them as temporary positions we adopt for social functioning. The click isn't an intellectual understanding. You don't think your way to it. It's a total body experience, a feeling of pieces falling into place, of seeing a pattern that was always there, but invisible until this exact moment. Jung compared it to those optical illusions where you stare at random dots until suddenly they organize into a clear picture. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The old way of perceiving yourself and the world becomes impossible to return to. What you see in that moment varies by individual, but Jung identified common themes across his clinical observations. You see how you've been living according to other people's expectations, performing a version of yourself designed to earn love, approval, success, safety. You recognize the parts of yourself you exiled to the shadow, the qualities you labeled as bad or unacceptable and tried to eliminate, only to have them control you from the unconscious. You understand that the people you attracted into your life, especially those who hurt you, were reflecting aspects of yourself you needed to integrate. You realize that the version of reality you've been operating in was just one interpretation, not objective truth. The meanings you assigned to events, the stories you told about why things happened, the beliefs you held about how the world works, all of it was constructed, not discovered. This doesn't mean nothing is real or true. It means your previous perception was filtered through layers of unconscious conditioning that you mistook for clear sight. The click is when those filters become visible, and you can choose which ones to keep and which to discard. Jung warned that this moment of clarity can be overwhelming. Some people experience it as ego death, where the sense of being a separate, solid self temporarily dissolves completely. Others experience it as awakening, where they feel more alive and present than ever before. The intensity of the experience often correlates with how rigidly you were holding on to your previous identity. The tighter the grip, the more violent the release. In his own writings, Jung described how intensely disorienting this transition can be, comparing it to standing at the edge of an abyss where all your familiar landmarks have vanished and you're suspended between two states of being. What happens immediately after the click determines whether this becomes a transformation or just a temporary glimpse. Jung observed that many people have the realization and then immediately try to translate it back into their old framework. They turn it into another identity, another role to perform. They become the enlightened person, the awakened one, the truth teller. They've seen through the game, but then immediately start playing a new version of it. This is what Jung called inflation, where you identify with the archetype of the wise one instead of integrating the wisdom into a balanced personality. The real integration happens when you can hold the awareness without making it your new identity. You understand that you're playing roles while knowing their roles. You participate in social agreements while recognizing their agreements, not ultimate reality. You feel emotions without believing you are your emotions. You think thoughts without assuming their absolute truth. Jung called this the individuated person, someone who has integrated conscious and unconscious contents into a functional whole. But this integration isn't a one-time event. The click is the beginning, not the end. What follows is the difficult work of living with this awareness in a world where most people are still asleep to these dynamics. You can't explain it to them because the understanding isn't intellectual, it's experiential. You can't go back to shallow conversations about surface-level topics because you've seen the deeper patterns underneath. You can't participate in unconscious games because you're now aware they're games. This creates a specific kind of loneliness. You're surrounded by people who seem to be sleepwalking through life, repeating patterns they can't see, defending positions they've never examined, chasing goals they adopted without question. You want to shake them awake, but Jung discovered that you can't force someone else's click. It has to come from their own internal process. The best you can do is live as an example of conscious awareness and be available when others start to wake up. The world after the click operates on different rules. You stop expecting other people to complete you because you understand that wholeness comes from integrating your own shadow, not finding the perfect partner. You stop chasing achievement as proof of worth because you recognize that worth isn't something you earn, it's something you acknowledge. You stop running from discomfort because you've learned that growth happens in the tension between what is and what's becoming. Jung noticed that people who experienced the click and integrated it properly became more effective in the world, not less. They weren't escaping into spiritual bypassing or checking out of responsibility. They were engaging more fully, but without the desperate attachment to outcomes that comes from using external success to validate internal worth. They could pursue goals without their identity depending on achieving them, They could love people without needing those people to fulfill unconscious parental needs. They could participate in culture without being completely defined by it. The click reveals that you've been living in a prison of your own construction, and the door was never locked. Every limitation you believed was real was actually a belief you inherited and never questioned. Every impossible barrier was actually a boundary you created to stay safe. Every fixed aspect of your personality was actually a defense mechanism you could release. Jung's most radical insight was that human beings are far more fluid, far more capable of change, far less determined by their past than we typically believe. But this freedom comes with responsibility. Once you see that you've been unconsciously creating your reality through your beliefs, perceptions, and reactions, you can't blame external circumstances anymore. You become the author of your experience, which means you're also responsible for editing the story when it's not working. This responsibility is what makes many people resist the click, even when they're right on the edge of it. It's easier to believe you're a victim of circumstances than to acknowledge you've been unconsciously participating in creating those circumstances. The people around you will sense the change, even if they can't articulate it. Some will be drawn to your increased presence and authenticity. Others will be threatened by it, because your consciousness reflects their unconsciousness back to them. Jung documented how individuated people often lose friends and relationships during this transition, not because they become cruel or superior, but because they stop playing the unconscious roles that held those relationships together. If a friendship was based on mutual complaining, it dissolves when you stop complaining. If a relationship was based on rescuing and being rescued, it ends when you stop needing rescue and stop offering it. This pruning of relationships isn't failure, it's alignment. You're making space for connections based on conscious choice rather than unconscious need. The loneliness is temporary, though it can feel permanent while you're in it. Jung observed that individuated people eventually find each other, recognizing in others the same quality of presence and awareness they've developed in themselves. These connections operate on a different level than unconscious relationships. There's more space, more honesty, more capacity to see each other clearly without projection. What Jung found most fascinating about the click was its irreversibility. Once you've seen through the illusion, you can't unsee it. You can pretend for social purposes. You can play along when it's appropriate. But you can never again fully believe in the roles the way you did before. The awareness is permanent. This is both the curse and the gift. The curse is that you can't go back to the comfort of unconsciousness. The gift is that you're no longer controlled by forces you don't understand. The click doesn't make life easier. If anything, it makes life more complex because you're aware of layers and dynamics you were previously blind to. But it makes life more real. You're actually living your life instead of performing a script someone else wrote. You're making choices based on authentic preferences instead of unconscious programming. You're building relationships based on genuine connection instead of complementary neuroses. You're pursuing meaning instead of just avoiding discomfort. Jung spent his entire career studying this transformation because he experienced it himself during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For years after his break with Freud, he descended into psychological chaos, flooded with unconscious contents he couldn't control or understand. His click came when he stopped trying to control it and instead learned to dialogue with it, to integrate it consciously. Everything he taught about individuation came from this personal experience of dying to his old identity and being reborn into a more conscious relationship with himself. He wanted others to have this experience without the years of suffering he endured. That's why he documented the signs, the stages, the patterns. Not to create a formula, because the click can't be manufactured, but to help people recognize when they're in the pre-click state and encourage them to stay with it instead of running back to the familiar prison of unconsciousness. The discomfort you're feeling isn't a sign that something's wrong. It's a sign that something's trying to become right. Let's look at a narrative illustration that captures this transformation. We see this dynamic clearly in the story of someone who spent decades building what looked like a perfect life from the outside. Successful career, stable marriage, respected in the community. But internally, they felt like a fraud performing a character they'd created to please everyone else. The click came during a moment of complete stillness after a minor crisis. Nothing catastrophic, just a small failure that cracked the facade. In that crack, they saw the entire architecture of lies they'd been living. Not malicious lies, but the kind we all tell ourselves about who we need to be to deserve love and acceptance. The realization didn't come with drama or fanfare. It was quiet, almost gentle, but absolutely irreversible. From that moment forward, they could no longer pretend the performance was real. This type of awakening, based on patterns Jung observed repeatedly, shows how the click often arrives not during our loudest moments, but in our quietest ones. When the noise finally stops and you're left alone with the truth you've been running from, that's when consciousness breaks through. The individual in this composite example didn't immediately quit their job or leave their marriage. Instead, they began the slow work of becoming authentic within those structures, or consciously choosing to leave them when authenticity became impossible within them. You're reading this because you're close. Maybe you've been circling this realization for months or years. Maybe you've had glimpses but couldn't sustain the awareness. Maybe you're in the middle of a crisis that's breaking down your old structures. Whatever brought you here, understand that the click is coming. You can't force it, but you can stop resisting it. You can sit with the discomfort instead of immediately medicating it with distractions. You can question your assumptions instead of defending them. You can observe your patterns instead of unconsciously repeating them. The moment before the click feels like standing on the edge of a cliff with no visible ground below. Your ego screams at you to step back to safety. Every survival instinct tells you that jumping means death. And in a sense, it does. The version of you that's been running the show will die. But what's born in its place is more real, more alive, more capable of genuine experience than the constructed self ever was. Jung called this psychological death and rebirth, and it's the most important transition a human being can make. You'll only see this once, this exact configuration of awareness you have right now. Tomorrow, you'll either have clicked and be living in a new reality, or you'll have retreated back into unconsciousness, and this moment will feel like a distant dream. The choice isn't really a choice, because consciousness, once glimpsed, has its own momentum. You can delay it, but you can't stop it. The unconscious will keep escalating until you pay attention. The question is whether you'll meet it consciously or let it break you down until you have no choice. This is your warning and your invitation. The click is close. Stay awake. Stay present. Stop running. Let the old structures crumble. Trust that what emerges from the chaos will be more true than what you're leaving behind. Jung spent decades proving that this transformation is possible, that consciousness can evolve, that human beings are not fixed entities, but fluid processes capable of profound change. Time 0.6s. You are standing exactly where hundreds of his patients stood before they clicked. The next moment changes everything. If you've felt this building, if you recognize these patterns, if you're tired of performing a role that no longer fits, comment below, it finally clicked. And if you want to understand more about what happens after this moment, make sure you're subscribed, because the integration process is just beginning. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, In stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get the Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.